Okay, so thank you for agreeing to sit for this interview, and I'm going to ask you to begin the way I have with most everyone I've interviewed, and tell me, how did you get interested in the Soviet Union? What was it about that pulled you in?
Yeah, my standard answer is it was all my grandfather's fault. My grandfather emigrated to the U.S. As a young kid with his mother. Actually, his father came over quite some time ahead. My grandfather barely knew him. He was an infant when his father came over. His father had raised horses and cattle in Russia and moved to Chicago, worked in the stockyards, saved money, got his papers, and eventually sent for my great grandmother and my grandfather. He was about 7 or 8 years old when he came over. And, it was just fascinating for
Where do
me
you
that
know where did they live in
they lived in Chicago. So he
yeah.
moved to Chicago. He worked in the stockyards. His father opened up a butcher shop. My grandfather worked in the unions for the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butcher Workers Union, and eventually became a labor arbitrator. He left school when he was probably 11 or 12 to work, not to buy comic books and candy, but so that his younger siblings who were all born in the US could go to school. And he eventually went to University of Chicago at night and he got his bachelor's. He was in his 30s and then eventually got did his graduate work. And he worked for NLRB and then eventually became a labor arbitrator and worked till the day he died when he was almost 90 years old.
Wow. Wow.
But for
Where
me,
were they from in Russia?
so they were from north of St. Pete, not in, but not far from Petrozavodsk. And there was, family from St. Pete. There was other parts of the family that were more sort of affluent, not wealthy, but yeah, I mean, for me, it was this mysterious place with this really cool alphabet, and I was the only grandson. My grandfather and I were super tight. And I decided early on I wanted to learn Russian. And, for me, also a child of the Cold War, this was, before Ronald Reagan, but, it was the evil empire. And I wanted to learn Russian and, wanted to go kick some Soviet ass and saw this was a part of the world that was important that, my grandfather, but for the grace of God, here I am, thanks to him. I could have been, he could have stayed and, or his family could have stayed and, it would be a very different kind of existence. But, he was a classic example of the American dream, guy who came over here with a family with very little and left school early and eventually graduated from one of the top universities in the country, worked his butt off and did very well for himself.
Yeah.
And he never let me or my cousins or my sister forget that. He was a big advocate of education, but also an incredible believer and case study of the American dream. So, for me, it was kind of a no-brainer. I knew early on I wanted to take Russian. And as a kid growing up in Connecticut, I knew I wanted to go to a school, a private school that had Russian, and that's why I ended up going to the private school for high school I went to. Interestingly enough, Victoria Newland and I were at the same school. We were in classes together when we were 14, 15.
Wow.
It ended up going very different directions on the Russia scale. But it's interesting because we both started off as sort of young Cold Warriors. And, I remember her telling these emotional stories about, sitting on her bubby's lap and hearing stories about the Cossacks raping and pillaging in the shtetls. And she had this deep-seated sort of antipathy towards Russia that went beyond the Soviet side, but was more, sort of cultural, whatever. But anyway, um, yeah, I mean,
Yeah. Where was this high school?
it was Choate School.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, it's also where Hedrick Smith went, who wrote The Russians. And a lot of people in my day in the early 90s in Moscow came out of the various prep schools that had Russian programs. I mean, Marcus, Montana Court, he went to Lawrenceville. There was a large contingent that went to Andover. What's really sad is I can't comment on the other schools, but Choate abandoned Russian, and they actually had not only Russian language, they had a Russian studies center at the school. And they got rid of Russian about, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago and picked up Arabic and Chinese. And, it's not so much a commentary on Choate as a school, but we've seen this happen throughout academia where Russia studies programs in Russian language in secondary schools, colleges, universities has really kind of fallen off the cliff.
Yeah.
And it's something that I personally think is having very bad impact um, on our policy. There's
Yeah.
this huge gap of subject matter expertise because it ultimately starts very early.
Yeah. And so so you graduated in what year from high school?
I graduated from high school in 1978. They, for years, had a annual trip, and they would go over to the Soviet Union. And a couple year or two before I got there, they had an incident where some kid thought it would be very funny. Um, he got a postcard of Lenin, and again, this is mid 1970s. I don't know the whole story, but I think his roommate was either Israeli or had strong connections to Israel. So he took the Lenin picture in a pen and he put an eye patch and tried to make him look like Moshe Dayan, and then put all these comments on the front and mailed it to his buddy at Choate. And I think within 48 hours, there was a knock on the door at the hotel and he was brought in for questioning. And that was it for the Russian trip for many years
Wow.
until after I
Wow.
was there.
Yeah.
And I don't know the details if it was the Soviet side said forget it, or if the school basically said, you know what, that was a close call. We don't want to risk any more of these little prep school boys getting gobbled up by the KGB. And you know, but the bottom line is, it unfortunately for me, I didn't get to participate in that.
Yeah. So you didn't get to go. So
Not so many years later.
yeah. Yeah. And so where did you go from there with this interest?
So, and I continued my study of Russian in college at Boston University. And, at that point, the at that point, I started focusing more on the world of business, and there wasn't a lot of opportunity to use Russian. And, one thing kind of led to another. And even though I still had this passion for it, it kind of just sort of waned a bit. And, fast forward to 1986, I had an opportunity um, to go on a trip over to the Soviet Union that was organized by, of all things, the Columbus, Ohio Art Museum. And it was basically friends of my parents were trustees there, and they were going on the trip, and they knew I had an interest, and they asked if I'd be interested in going, and I'd always wanted to go. So I went. And that was January, February of 86. It was, I'll never forget, it was right after the Challenger disaster. And it was also not long after Reagan's Evil Empire speech. Or I don't know if it was the Evil Empire, it was when he said, the hot mic, and he made the comment, ladies and gentlemen, in 5 minutes, we'll commence bombing the Soviet Union. And which to this day I don't think was an accident. I think that was also very intentional.
Yeah.
But whatever. So it was a fascinating time, getting there. And, on one hand, all the Russians I met were like, so actually sincere and emphatic in their sympathies for what happened with the Challenger. And then in the same sentence would immediately shift in like, why does your president want to kill us? Why does he want to start World War III? And it was interesting because, in America, in the American political context, especially a young person in their 20s, it was what he said. We kind of laughed about it. It was almost like a Saturday Night Live punchline. And at the same time, people in the Soviet union, even people I met who were, black marketeers or, sort of refusenick types or whatever, who were by no means, KGB types or KGB plants. And that, believe me, there were plenty of those, and you could spot them a mile away. Um, were so sincere in their concern. And it really struck me that this was not a language divide. It wasn't even an ideological divide. There was this huge cultural divide. And that was when I first started to understand that there's a big difference between being bilingual and bicultural. And,
Hmm.
I think growing up with Russian relatives, in my family, we had an expression. My mother, one day somebody was being really dogmatic and she was just getting really frustrated. And she said, "Stop it. You're being like my Russian relative. Stop being a Russian relative." And that became a term in my family for when somebody just became irrationally dogmatic. And, it didn't matter what you did, what you said. You could come up with all the empirical evidence and data, but they were not going to budge. And I point that out because I think those experiences helped me out enormously in my time in Russia, because it drove home that language is only half, if not less than half of the battle.
Hmm.
And understanding things in a cultural and historical context is as important as being able to pick the right words.
Hmm.
Um, so, that was a fascinating trip, and it really kind of reawakened this desire in me to do something with it professionally. So, a few years later, I made the decision. I was thinking about business school, and I decided, no, I'm not going to go to business school and do traditional MBA. I decided I wanted to go to CIS, and I applied CIS and a bunch of the other IR foreign policy schools. I got into CIS, and meanwhile, I'd spent a lot of time in Berlin, um, where again, I this all happened sort of simultaneous with the Russia thing. I guess again, this goes back to when I was in eighth grade and in civics class, we had to do a term paper, and I did this term paper on Berlin and the division of Germany. And I was
Hmm.
interested in that because I again remember as a little kid going with my parents and seeing Torn Curtain with Paul Newman and Julie Andrews, the Hitchcock movie. And then, around the same time, seeing Funeral in Berlin with Michael Caine. And as a little kid, and little kids think about everything in a very logical, rational way. I'm like, wait a minute, it's one country, it's one city. Why would you get shot trying to go from one end to the other? That'd
Right.
be like if
Right.
you lived in Boston, you're trying to go from Back Bay to Cambridge, and if you do that, you get shot and killed. I don't get it. So I spent a lot of time in Berlin, and initially, became fascinated with divided societies, the Germanys, the Koreas. And I was really kind of torn about maybe studying German, maybe studying Russian. And, I felt like I really wanted to go to Berlin. And I started CIS in the fall of '89 after spending a good part of the previous summer in Berlin. And, one day I came home from class. We didn't have cell phones or text messaging then. And there was like, I don't know, 30 messages on my machine. And everybody's like, "Are you watching TV? Did you see what happened?" And I'm like, "No, what happened?" I'm like, "What the hell is going on?" And and one of my good friends called a bunch of times, and I'm like, about to like put on the TV. I'm trying to figure out what the heck's going on. And the phone rang. It was one of those friends. He's like, "Dude, have you seen the TV?" And I'm like, "No." And he's like, "Put it on." I said, "What channel?" He goes, "It doesn't matter." And I went, and it was, this is November, I guess, 9th, 8th, 9th, whatever. And he's like, "What do you think?" I said, "I think I got to hang up and I got to call Pan Am because I got to go to Berlin." And I called all my professors and I said, you know, "You know me, what?" And they're like, "No, we get it. Go. We'll figure it out. Whatever." Everybody was supportive except for my Russian teacher. Do you know Natasha Symes at SAIS? She runs the Russian
No,
language
no, but
program.
the Symes part is familiar, but
She's the ex-wife of Dmitry.
all right,
I
okay.
had both of them at SAIS. She was like, "No, you can't go." And I'm like, "Well, guess what? I bought a ticket and I'll see you in a week." And it was an incredible experience. But, it became very clear to me at that point, it was unsustainable that, there were dominoes and it wasn't if, it was when. So I made a decision that summer. I wanted to go spend the summer in Moscow. I wanted to work on my Russian. Again, Natasha Symes was livid that I didn't stay in Washington to take her Russian program at CIS. And I was
Uh-huh.
like, why would I take a Russian program in a classroom on Mass Ave when I can do it at MGU and spend the whole summer in Russia?
Right.
I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. Natasha and I never got along well. But
Yeah.
anyhow, um, so I spent that summer on a program at MGU that was organized by ACTR. And it was a phenomenal experience. It was a weird experience.
And that was the first time you were in Russia.
No, the first time was that trip in
Oh, I'm
1986.
sorry. 86, right. So this was, well, then it was the Soviet Union.
It
Then
was still
you,
Sovietsky
it was
Soyuz. So
still
by this
late
time,
Soviet period when you were there.
it was
Yeah.
the summer of 1990.
Okay.
So I'm all excited because here I am. They had programs at like Moscow Financial Institute, all the different institutes, but I wanted to go to MGU because that was it, and I wanted to live in the main building. And I got there, and I was so excited. And then I realized that this wasn't really MGU. They were using the MGU facilities, and it was really mediocre language classes, but more so, I was on a floor that was all Americans, Canadians, and Australians. The floor below us was French. Floor above us was like Hungarians. It was basically, we were completely segregated. And
Right.
when we would go to the общежитие and, we go down to down to the cafeteria, and we'd sit down and there were Russian kids and we'd be like, hey guys, we're from America, talk to us. They were like, looked at us like we said we had cholera, and they just picked up their trays and left and it took me a while before I realized for these guys, besides joining Komsomol and everything else, getting there was a huge deal. This was not only a huge privilege and an honor, but it was something that a lot of people worked very hard for. And to risk it by hanging out with and talking to a bunch of Americans, they weren't about to do that. And it became
Yeah.
very clear who the plants were because they were the ones who were very friendly and solicitous and came over and then would very loudly say, yes, Soviet Union sucks. I hate communism. I want to make lots of money. Can we start trading money? And it was just like, seriously? But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
my roommate, you may have even come across him. Was at the time a student at Columbia SIPA is a guy named Blake Marshall, who later worked with
Oh,
Gene
yeah.
Lawson at um,
At
the
AmCham. Oh, no,
yeah, at
U.S.
U.S. Russia.
Business Council,
Yeah,
right?
and
Yeah,
Blake's a great guy. We
I
just
knew him fairly well actually in the
Yeah,
day. Yeah.
Blake's a great guy. We were roommates at
Yeah.
MGO, and we kind of, after a while, stopped going to class and just started meeting people. And he was a big basketball player, so he got to know people playing basketball. I mean, Blake and I joked that we were going to learn Russian with Vietnamese, Hungarian, and Nigerian accents because, you know, those are the people we were meeting at the university. And it was eventually through black market stuff. I brought over the mother load of Levi's, condoms, tons. I don't smoke. I had enough Marlboro Reds to kill a small sized Soviet city. Um,
Right.
and that's how we eventually started meeting people. I played rugby in college and in grad school and for a couple clubs in the DC area. And I ended up that summer. I met some of the guys from the British Embassy through, some of the expat circles, and I played rugby with them and got to meet some of the Russians from one of the Russian clubs, and that was really a big breakthrough. That's how I really finally got to meet people. But I also got to meet a lot of people in the expat community. One of my teammates in rugby was Chris Steele. it was an interesting time and an interesting crowd. And
All
I
right.
loved the community in Moscow. And I basically said, I'm coming back. And I remember like in my last week there, going to all these parties and people are like, well, stay in touch. And I'm like, no, I'll be back. When? Well, probably next summer. What are you going to be doing? I don't know, but I'm going to be back. That was
Yeah.
my decision. And that became my focus. So when I was job hunting, it was an interesting process because, at CIS, they had a lot of these very prestigious corporate recruiting training programs like Mobile and JP Morgan. And I went through all those. I actually got job offers from both of them. They were hyper competitive. And when I turned down the JP Morgan one, a lot of my friends and classmates were really angry. They're like, if you weren't really serious about that, you shouldn't have even gone that far because, I wanted that job or whatever.
Yeah.
But
Right.
I realized, and like I was talking to Credit Suisse versus Boston. At that point, it was before Jordan and Jennings launched the business in Russia.
Right.
And, they were like, look, we really like you. Russia's something on our target. We're going to do it. Don't know when we're going to do it, but would you be interested in being in London or Budapest or Prague? And I was like, I want to go to Russia. And it all happened. It was, again, life works in weird ways. Um, I got a call from my mother, and she said, they had this friend, and he was much younger than my parents. He was younger than them, older than me, and I knew him, but he had recently, like a year before, gotten married to this Australian woman. They were living in England, and he died in this tragic car accident. And they said, listen, Peter's wife is, she's really in bad shape, so she's decided she's going to travel around America, clear her head, take some time out. She's going to be in Washington, D.C. We know you're busy. Would you mind, it'll be your good deed of the day, meet with her, take her out for coffee or lunch or something. So, I rolled my eyes and said, okay, okay. And I met with her, super nice lady. And, we're talking about what I was doing. And I knew that she came from a family of, her father was an incredibly successful, well-known entrepreneur and businessman in Australia. And we're talking, and she's like, you really should talk to my father. He's been working on some projects related to Russia, and I don't know the details. They're energy related, but he's really frustrated because, just dealing with them, and none of the people he has working for him seem to understand how to do things there. And you should talk to him. She's like, would you mind? I'm like, no, I'd appreciate it. So I started this weird thing with this guy where he would call me, and my friends and I joked about it because he would call me like every few days, and I wouldn't even call it an interview. We had these conversations. Every time I talked to him, he was in a different country in a different time zone, and every conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door and his room service being rolled in. So I was always kind of like, is he having lunch, dinner, breakfast? And after, like the third or fourth call, he said, listen, I got great people who work for me. He goes, they're finance guys, they're geologists, they're engineers. He said, we're working on this oil project. He goes, but they don't understand Russia. He's like, I don't know if I have a job for you. He goes, I may not. He goes, I don't even know if this is going to go anywhere. He goes, but I'll tell you what, can I commission you to do this analysis? And his whole premise was their view was they were looking at developing resources. And you got to keep in mind, this is like
Yeah. When is this?
December 90, January, February 91. This is probably early 91 because I think I met her like around Thanksgiving or Christmas, just before
Yeah.
Christmas break in 90. So this is my second year at CIS, and I'm going through all these interviews, and I had a couple offers and I'm waiting for others. So yeah, let's say it's first quarter 91. And
Okay.
he said, look, this is my view. He said, I don't know anything about the Soviet Union. I don't know anything about these places. I'm just a guy who lives in Australia and knows how to make money off of resources. He said, but I do know this. He who sits on the resources controls the resources, and he who controls it ultimately is the guy you deal with. Because he said, if you deal with anyone else, ultimately you're going to get screwed. He said, and we're not Exxon, we're not Mobil, we're not Arco, we're not Amico. He said,
Yeah.
so our whole approach is to go to the smaller, to the guys on the ground. What do you think of that? And I said, I absolutely agree. That's the way to go. I said, things are changing. Things are going to change even more and change faster. So he said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to commission you to do a report. He said, it doesn't have to be long. I don't want a lot of citations. You can footnote it all you want. I'm not going to read them. I don't give a crap. He's like, I just want to know why you think this is the best approach, given the way things work in the Soviet Union and Russia, et cetera. So I write this thing up, and he's like, and we'll pay you for it. Send it to me. We'll figure it out afterwards. But if that's okay, don't worry, we'll compensate you for it. So, and this whole thing, by the way, again, the way we're doing this is I'm faxing these things to his office in Australia. That's faxing it to him, to Papua New Guinea, to New Zealand, to Argentina.
Right.
I mean, this guy is
Right.
literally like, living off of room service all over the planet. So like a few days later, I get a call from him and he's like, hey, listen, I just finished reading this and I read it to my guys and I passed it on to so-and-so. What you said is absolutely, he said, I agree with it. He said, and I didn't tell you everything, but that's the approach we're taking. He said, I want to tell you more, but we'll have to put an NDA in place. He said, but in the meantime, he said, I owe you something for this. He goes, but I'll tell you what I want to hear from you is what could go wrong? And he said, and I kind of laughed. I'm like, what could go wrong? You want me to tell you what could go right? It'll take me be a lot shorter than what could go wrong. And he's like, well, can you do a SWOT analysis? What are the scenarios of things that could go wrong, but also how these could ultimately be catalysts for change? And, he's like, and, we've got Gorbachev and he seems like he wants the right things. He's going in the right direction. What could change it? What are the biggest risks to him? And ultimately, could that be really bad or potentially a positive catalyst? So I wrote this analysis and I wish I still had it because it was basically a coup scenario of exactly what happened in August of 91. And,
Uh-huh.
and, and my analysis was it would go one of two ways. It would get really bad and the bad guys would secure power, or it could ultimately be a catalyst if all the ducks were in a row in the right way. I put a lower probability on that, but I said if the right person stepped up at the right time, it could be a positive catalyst that could actually speed up the process of giving the regions more control. So he called me up and he's like, okay, what I didn't tell you is this. We have a meeting in 10 days in London, and we got all these guys coming over from Siberia, and they're coming over from Tyumen Nefty Gas and Nizhny Novgorod Nefty Gas. And we're actually talking about making this thing happen. And our plan is we want to create a private company with Russian assets, with British Australian leadership and financing and management that we can list in London or on a Western exchange. And he said, and we're working with Morgan Grenfell, we're working with these lawyers. And he's like, I know we don't have the NDA in place, but this is all happening. Would you come over here? We'll fly you to London. You'll spend a week here. We'll print you up business cards. You'll be part of our team. Your job is going to be the guy who, at the table, when we're negotiating stuff, keeps your mouth shut and your ears open. I want you to also get to know these Russian guys, because the guy who says to the boss with the fancy business card, I know that guy's not the boss. He goes, I want to know who's the real boss. And he said, and I mean the guy who actually is going to control what happens to the assets. He said, and I want you to be the guy, like when we're not in meetings, could sit down with me and my team and help us understand who's who and what's what. And he goes, and when you get over here, we'll talk about what I owe you for those 2 papers you did. And we'll figure out a proper way to compensate you for your time.
Okay, so when was this meeting?
So this meeting was immediately after school it was right after exams ended, and
Right.
it was like 2 weeks before graduation.
Okay. Okay.
So this was in that, I just finished my last exam when we had talked, And the next day, I get on a plane to London. And, so this whole thing is at the Ritz. I'm staying at the Ritz. I got room service, everything. He's like, order whatever you want. And I'm hanging out with these Russians. And, the long and short of it is, like halfway through that week, it became clear that we're on track to have a deal. And he said, listen, I want to talk to you. And I sat down with him and two of his guys, and they're like, here's the deal. This is going to happen. Whether we have the final agreement this week or not, we're definitely going to have to take the next step. He said, we need somebody on the ground. How would you like to go to Moscow and be our guy on the ground and be the point man in Russia on this project?
Wow.
And he's like, I know we owe you for the other stuff, but here's what I'll offer you. And we'll pay you X amount. We'll provide housing. We'll do this. We'll do that. And it was like, okay, I'm in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was funny
I
because
mean, he took a big risk taking someone as young as you, and even though you spoke the language and you'd studied, you didn't have any on the ground experience or experience in the industry
I
at
didn't have
that
a
point.
flipping clue. But let me
Yeah.
tell you, this guy, his name was Alan Burns. He was an amazing man. And he was a guy who grew up originally born in Scotland. The family emigrated to Australia. He grew up in and around construction sites, and he built himself a massive fortune because he was a risk taker with huge confidence and belief in his insights, and enough belief that when he failed, and he failed on many occasions, he didn't get discouraged. He learned lessons from those experiences and then did better in the next one. And,
Uh-huh.
his batting average was, I mean, we all know in baseball, if you're batting over 350, you're having a hell of a season.
Yeah.
And his philosophy in business was the same. And he took chances on people and he took a chance on me. But I'll tell you something, that was the thing that was fascinating about Moscow in those days, looking back in hindsight. And Joe Crowley. Joe
Sounds big.
Crowley, he worked with
No.
Marcus. He was at Sealand and then
Oh,
Maris
okay. No,
Ventures.
that's a set of people I didn't know.
Oh, okay.
So,
Joe's a
yeah.
great guy. I mean, he's one of my better friends from my Moscow days. We've joked about it. I mean, I look at all the guys that got there when I did, me, Marcus, Joe, and nothing against them or me. We were all way out of our league. We
Yeah.
were in positions that we could never have had or should never have had under other circumstances. But the combination of the fact that A, we understood the language, and B, more importantly, we were willing to go there and move there and live in that kind of environment, is how we got started. And look, when I got back from that London trip and I told these friends of mine at CIS, not only am I not taking the job at JP Morgan or at Mobil or Credit Suisse, but I'm moving to Moscow to work with some crazy guys from Perth and Western Australia who think that they're going to make the next British Petroleum on nothing. Everybody was like, you need to have your head checked. Like, are you insane? But my philosophy was, I'm in my 20s. I have no debt. Worst case scenario, this thing goes belly up and implodes. The worst that's going to happen is I'm going to have a few good stories, a
Yeah.
couple interesting experiences, and I'll have a wealth of knowledge to learn from. And
Absolutely.
you,
Yeah.
you know, when I looked at your questions, that first one, you said attracted by business opportunities, chance to reform, participate in history, the adventure, the exotic. It was yes, all of the above.
All the above. Yeah. Yeah.
So, for me, I thought it was the easiest decision I ever had to make. So by this time, this is in June of 91. Um, so, right after the graduation, I packed up my place in DC. I sold my car. I flew over to London, spent time with the team in London, which was the operating hub for everything, and flew to Moscow and
Yeah.
moved into this apartment that they had hired this local fixer who was just a complete, what we call a square rooter, working all the angles,
Yeah.
uh, who in due course I figured out was working too many angles, but
Yeah.
got me started, and that there was a place to live and everything. Eventually, focused on doing things the proper way, getting accreditation, et cetera, but mostly focused on developing the relationship with the guys, first in two men. And once we really got the foundation agreements in place, it was really more on the operating side. And from that point on, I was back and forth to Nizhny Vartovsk, and I had the uh, I had the great honor of being able to say I had apartments in both Moscow and Nizhny Vartovsk.
Uh-huh.
And let me tell
Wow.
you, Nizhny Vartovsk in late 1991, you would take a shower and you'd be dirtier after your shower than you were before you got under the water.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask you what it was like in Nizhny Vartovsk at that time. Um, were there other foreigners there at the time?
So, out in Siberia, Nizhny Vartovsk, there were not a ton. I mean, but they were in pockets. There were a lot cycling in and out, and same in two men. People were coming in and out and negotiating. But, White Knights have been operating for a while north of
Oh,
there,
okay.
and they had people. I mean, you've landed the airport in Nizhny Vartovsk, and, you would see like five white Ford F-350 dually pickups
Yeah.
with the Soviet yellow foreign venture plates with like an Oklahoma license plate underneath. And the service companies were coming in, but it was a fascinating time. What
Yeah.
what I didn't tell you about is really the big turning point for us, though, was the coup in 91.
Right.
And so the venture that we were involved in, so the company I worked for was EuroSov Petroleum. And that was this company put together by the Australian guy I told you about. And his company was Vanguard Petroleum. And on the Russian side, we were dealing with the Shafronik brothers, Yuri Shafronik and Sergei Shafronik.
Okay. They're
Are you familiar
pretty
with them at
famous.
all?
I remember the names. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, brothers, very close. And it's interesting because, when we started out and we had that first meeting in London, that was before the Shafronics were involved. But there are other guys, and it became very clear right away that Sergei was the main guy. Sergei's
Uh-huh.
brother, Yuri Shafronik, he was the chair of the Oblast Soviet in two men. In other words, he was basically the governor.
Uh-huh.
So Sergei was really handling the local GR. We met with Yuri once or twice. And the guy who was my boss when I first started was an American, a very knowledgeable oil and gas guy, had done a lot of oil and gas stuff, but he had never operated outside the English speaking world. He'd done stuff mostly in North America. He did stuff in Australia, Papua New Guinea. And it was the work he did in Australia and in the South Pacific. He got to know this guy, Alan Burns, who hired me. So he was running the project, and he was a very smart petroleum guy out of Denver, but hadn't spent a lot of time in exotic cultures, shall we say, let
Yeah.
alone Russia, let alone the Soviet Union, and spoke zero Russian. I'll put it to you this way: like the first time he and I went out to Siberia together, out to Tyumen, um, this was the 90s, and
Right.
drinking was a huge part of the relationship building process.
Right.
Really, people call it relationship building. It was relationship vetting. It was them vetting us.
Right.
And, at one point he's like, well, I think they do this to weaken us so they can, take advantage of us. I said, no, they do it to weaken us so they can get to know us. That's what they're doing. They don't want to
Right.
see the facade. I said, it's actually important to get loaded with these guys so they see we're here for all the right reasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's okay. They're going to trust you more for it. But I knew we were in trouble the first time we went out. The vodka bottle came in, and he insisted on getting a Fanta and mixing it with his vodka. Um, the Russian guys, and you have to understand, these are Neftianik from Siberia. These are not,
Yeah.
these aren't even, foreign economic relations guys in Moscow, or, KGB guys or whatever. these are a bunch of, roughnecks, Siberian
Right,
roughnecks.
right. They probably had never seen someone take a Fanta and mix it with a
Well,
ruin vodka like that. Yeah,
with that, I don't want to say anything inappropriate, but they proceeded, and they knew he didn't speak Russian. They
yeah.
proceeded hitting me with a lot of questions about his gender identity and sexual preferences.
Right, right.
And at that point, their attitude about him was they could never trust him because anybody who mixes vodka with orange Fanta is not
Yeah,
trustworthy.
right.
Whereas, I was taking one for the team, and I my grandfather taught me a lot of valuable tricks, and the ability to drink tea from a glass in a scalding hot glass with a cube of sugar between your teeth is one, and the other was
Yeah,
how to drink vodka straight up warm.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
anyway,
So, and this guy was the London office, and you were the Moscow office.
yes.
Okay.
So
And was this a joint venture? Or what was this?
So it was very interesting. The whole principle was rather than a joint venture, rather than doing workover, up until that point, White Knights, everything else, they were all workover projects. The whole
Okay.
principle behind this was to take new fields that had not been developed, new fields that were off the grid but had huge commercial potential, and develop them using Western money, but also Western standards and technology.
Yeah,
Not doing like White Knights, where they even brought in, like, as I said, they had pickup trucks. They had Ford pickup trucks. They had Parker rigs, security drills, did all the drilling programs. The idea was to use as much Russian as we could, but use Western technology and equipment when and where it made a competitive difference. But to actually create a joint stock company that was jointly owned by Russian and Western interests, and that this joint stock company that was developing new fields could ultimately be listed on a Western exchange.
okay. Okay. So it was a Russian joint stock company.
Correct. Now,
Okay.
this was, again, we signed, this is all still the Sovietsky Soyuz. This is all leading
Right.
into the coup. So this guy from my American boss and I flew out to Tumen, and we had a bunch of meetings scheduled that week. And I always had my little Sony shortwave radio with me. And, at night and early morning, I would listen to VOA and BBC World Service, keep tabs on what's going on. And I woke up that morning, and I flipped it on, and it was like mid broadcast, and they're talking about what became very clear was a coup.
Uh-huh.
And after I like kind of jolted up and like had my holy shit moment, I got dressed super fast, didn't even bother showering. I ran downstairs, and we were staying at a guest house that was owned by Tumen Geologia, Tumen Geology, which was outside of the city. Beautiful spot, but again, it was very Soviet, and that they had you isolated. And it was immediately clear something different was going on. The ladies in the dining room weren't there. There wasn't music playing. There were people, and you could hear in the back room very hushed tones. There was no activity. There were no cars and drivers outside waiting. So, I went back up and I banged on my boss's door and I told him what's going on, and he instantly went into panic mode. He's like a headless chicken running around, throwing stuff. We got to get out of here. We got to get out of here. I'm like, John,
Right.
first of all, we're probably in the safest place you can be within the Soviet Union. Okay. Nothing
Yeah.
bad is going to happen here. And they're not going to let anything bad happen to us because they have bigger fish to fry. Okay. So whatever happens, we may be trapped here. I don't know. We got to learn more about what's going on. But A, we're physically safe. B, um, until we talk to the guys in charge, and that, we were already scheduled to see Shafronik, um, there's really nothing we can do. Okay. So calm down and whatever. Of course, he's downstairs. He's like, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of here. We got to get out of here. And I learned very quickly on that trip that the power of ability to speak the local language is really important, not just for communicating with them, but when you're with somebody who's panicking and doesn't know what they're doing, but they don't speak the language,
Right.
you can filter out their nonsense. So
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I finally was able to, the lady who kind of ran the place, who was clearly deeply concerned, and it made a lot of sense because this is a place that was designed to house guests, whether they were Soviet or foreign. I'm sure, the KGB local folks were on top of them and would debrief them after everybody came through, or whether they were working directly for them or not, who knows, whatever. And I told my
Right.
boss, look, you know, anything you say will be used against you in a court of law because this whole joint is wired.
Right.
Um, but she was very honest, like we just don't know what's happening, and she didn't want to talk about it. And I said, well, I need to call Shafronik's office, and she's like, well, I don't think that'll be possible. And I'm like, no, it's really important because we have this meeting. And anyway, long story short, eventually, two of the guys who had been to London pulled up in a car, and they were very shaken. And in hindsight, in later conversations we had over the next year, I learned more about these guys and their life stories. And in hindsight, these are people who grew up in the Stalin era, a lot of them,
Yeah.
and they were older, and they grew up as a kid hearing in the middle of the night, like 2, 3 in the morning, the sound of a car idling and running out to the window and seeing a parent or Uncle Oleg or you know, Aunt Ludmila being pushed into the back of a Chaika, never to be seen
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
So, these people were in a state of quiet, calm terror because they
Yeah.
didn't really know what was going to happen. And, one of these guys who I got to know really well, who's a wonderful, kind guy who was a geologist, he kept like, I could see he was getting teary and he's like, not just shaking my hand, but holding it. And he's like, should anything happen, I just want you to know it's been wonderful. You've been in a short time, you become a friend. And I really am so happy that you're here. And whatever happens, I hope everything's good for you and your family. I get emotional thinking about it now because you know we it was one of the many moments in my time in Russia that underscored lessons my grandfather tried to teach me about how much we take for granted.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But
Yeah.
anyway, long story short, that afternoon or later that afternoon, Shapronik's brother came and he said, listen, you got to give us some time. It's a crazy time. We're going to see my brother tomorrow. Okay. He's definitely going to meet you. He can't today. I'm sure you can understand. I'm like, no, I
Sure.
get it. We're
Yeah.
good. And he
Yeah.
stayed. We had dinner with him. We drank, 100
Yeah.
gram, 200, 300, whatever. We, you know, hit the banya, got all kinds of banged up. My boss is mixing it with the Fanta. Shafronik's just like, Kashman. Anyway, so the next day we go to Shafronik's office, and it was really interesting because you have to understand, while we had the radio and we're listening to BBC World Service and VOA, we still didn't really have a window into what's going on in the ground in Moscow. And
Right.
I was trying to contact friends of mine there, but it was not possible. Um, so the next day we go and we see Shafronik, and this is at the Obelisk Soviet. And when we got in there, he had two guys with him, one in uniform, one not. And he's like, these are Mr. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so. They run the local, the region, the Oblast division of the MVD. The guy who was in the suit, I assume, was actually KGB, but whatever. You know,
Right.
he's like, look, I don't know what's going to happen, but I do think these people are going to regret this. I think that this is going to be a huge moment in Russian history, not Soviet, Russian history. And I think we're going to turn a corner, but there's a lot that's uncertain. He goes, but I'll tell you what, if you're not feeling comfortable, I get it. I understand. He's like, they've arranged it. We have a car. We can take you right to the airport. They will get you on the the 2 o'clock flight.
Yeah.
Their contacts in Moscow will meet you at the flight. They'll take you to the other side of Sheremetyevo, and you'll get right on the BA flight to London. We've already made sure there are seats for you on both those flights. And my boss was like, yes, we got to go. And I'm like, And I basically said, no, John, we're staying. And he's like, you work for me. Or say, and I'm like, John, we'll discuss this later. Trust me. I said, this is the safest place we could be right now.
Right, right.
So I told them, I said, we came out here to do a deal with you, and we're going to stay here and do a deal with you. We're not leaving you. We're going to stay and see what happens. I found out quite some time later from both Chevronix that two of the majors, well, one of the big European companies and one of the majors had teams out there also, and they
Yeah.
all left.
And
And
they all,
honestly, that was a big part of why we ended up getting the deal, because we didn't get on the plane and we did
right,
stay.
right.
So the next day, um, a driver shows up and he's like, I'm here to take you to see Shafronic. And I'm like, oh, Sergey? He goes, no, Yuri. And we're like, oh. So we go to his office and he said, I'm glad you guys could be here. I'm glad you guys stayed. We're going to have a big ceremony and I want you there. And they were the first oblast, to my knowledge, that lowered the Soviet flag, and they had an MVD honor guard come out with the tricolor, and they raised the tricolor.
Wow.
And it was one of the first to do so, and he voiced his support for Yeltsin, and Yeltsin rewarded him. First, he became the first actual governor, and then
Yeah.
subsequently, Yeltsin brought him to Moscow, where he became Minister of Energy.
Okay, that's how I remember the name.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Um, and it's actually really interesting because um, I, after years, I reconnected with Yuri Shafronik in Moscow back in late 2021 and early 2022. I actually had lunch with him in February 22, which was the last time I was there. And it was actually organized by Matt Rajansky, who got to know him quite well. And he was very involved with the Dartmouth conference. And, after all those years, we were talking about, 30 years later,
Right.
and he shared with me about how the others left and that we stayed. And he said that he was very honest. He said, I didn't really know what was going to happen. He said, I knew that there was a possibility. Well, the guys who were with me from KGB and MVD, they were on my side. He said, but they could easily have gotten a call from their bosses in Moscow who said, hey, listen, you like your children? You want to see them tomorrow? You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was one of those things that it was wafer thin margins, but it worked out. But it was also really interesting hearing from him his perceptions, my boss and the Fanta
Right.
guy,
Right.
but also really about how um, um, about how it was really ordinary people, not just in Moscow, but in the regions, that made it very clear that they weren't going to put up with this anymore, that, Pandora's box was open.
Right.
And that was what opened up the floodgates and led to the,
Yeah. The story about staying is similar to what I heard from Stan Crampton, who was with US West at the time. I don't know if you know him, but
I
he and his
remember
wife,
him.
yeah,
God, I haven't seen him or heard that name in years.
well, he's passed away.
Oh, okay.
But
Explains why I haven't seen him lately.
yeah, but when we did the interview, he talked about what it meant that he and his wife didn't leave, and as an indicator of their commitment, that it made a huge difference for him in terms of how he was dealt with by the then Russian government as opposed to, the Soviet government that he had been dealing with. So it's similar, in that sense, that sense that you were with them in that period,
Yeah.
probably that's a huge difference, you know? So, so so you signed this agreement, you created the joint stock company. Did you drill in did you open up these new fields or not?
Okay. So, yes. So here's when we first started out, the assets that were in this company were mind-boggling. This was the treasure trove, the mother lode. Many of these were core assets that ended up being part of Yukos or other companies. Now, my bosses and our investors were over the moon. And this is one thing where I was warning them that in Russia, if something looks too good to be true, that's because it's really too good to be true.
True.
And
Yeah.
that in all likelihood, they were essentially being parked there for future
Wow.
reference. And that we would, we would without a question have some good resources, good assets to play with and develop, but we were not going to get everything that was in there. That just, these guys were not stupid. They weren't rubes. They weren't bumpkins.
Right.
They may not have worn very fancy suits, but I was always saying, don't let the gray plastic Romanian shoes fool you. These guys are shrewd and sharp. And, when it comes
And they
to,
knew their business. They knew
they knew
that.
their business. And it's interesting because the guys who worked for us, the geologists and the engineers, all, and these are Scottish guys who had worked all over the world. They all had the same comment. These guys could hold their own in West Texas or in the North Sea. These were real pros. They may not be polished. They may not understand the economics or how to finance a lot of these things,
Right.
but they knew the asset base and they knew the value of what they were sitting on, and they were not going to do anything dumb or desperate. And over time, it became increasingly clear, and my bosses kind of began to realize that and accept it because at the end of the day, we were doing fine. We ended up focusing primarily on a field called the Yuzhnoye field, which was south of Nizhny Vartovsk. That was the first focal point. And to bring it online, we actually got one of the first big financing projects in Russia from EBRD to construct a pipeline to tie it into the Transneft grid. And it was interesting. Again, it shows the creativity and the ingenuity of the Russians at the time. Getting approval to give a license to an entity that was owned by Westerners that wasn't a workover was not going to be easy. Being the first to do anything in any market is not easy, especially Russia at that period. But they used the environmental card. So here's a fun fact. I mean, I first went out to the Samotlor field. I don't know if you're familiar with Samotlor.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the first giant major or whatever
One of the biggest fields in the world, their first big
yeah.
development, I think back in the 70s.
Yep.
And the Samotlor field, when I first went out there in 91, they flared as much gas in the Samotlor field in one year as Brit Gas produced. And that was when Brit Gas was producing a lot of gas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sorry, they flared that much gas, not produced.
Yes.
They flared as much.
They flared it.
And in February, in midnight in February in Samotlor, you could read a newspaper without a flashlight. It was when you'd come into Nizhny Vartovsk, you could see this glow, like the sky was on fire. And as you made the approach, it was just unbelievable. It was the amount that they were flaring. And it goes back to the Soviet times. It was the bureaucracy. There was the Ministry of Oil, and then there was a Ministry of Gas, and then there was a Ministry of Geology. So Ministry of Geology would find the oil, they develop the well, they get it to the point where it could be extracted, then they would cap it and leave it, and then it would shift over to either Ministry of Oil or Ministry of Gas. Now, if it was primarily an oil producing well, they just flared the gas. If it was primarily a gas property, the liquids, they literally just dumped it on the ground. And that was the other thing, like up at Samotlor and some of these places. Talk about, you think Love Canal's bad. I mean, these things were total Superfund sites.
Yeah.
So the angle was we were getting a Western company, a Canadian contractor with North American fabricated and most importantly, coated pipe. The pipes that the Russians were using were just metal. They didn't have any coatings on the inside. So pipeline had a 5-6 year lifespan versus 15 or 20 years. And that the gas was going to be separated on site. We're bringing in ex-pro out of Scotland to bring in separating equipment. And they were going to build twin pipelines, and the gas would be collected and sold, some used on site for power,
Yeah.
and the rest would be sold into the into the Gazprom, grid, and the oil would go right into the Transneft grid. So it was really the environmental card that enabled us to get this thing off the road, off the ground. And
Uh-huh.
it was how they were able to keep it out of other Russians' hands. Now, the other part of how they were able to keep it out of other Russians' hands is that that's where this massive portfolio of properties were bit by bit. This got given here, that got given there, that got taken here, that got taken there. And, over time, the asset base shrank enormously.
And the they was there was a board or of this company, this Russian joint venture, and it wasn't controlled by you guys. It was controlled by the Russian management or the Russian owners
it
who
was,
did
it
this
was,
parceling.
in theory, the company, the joint stock company, because it wasn't a JV, it was effectively 50-50, but honestly, they really had the control over it and its destiny. And again, and which is frankly what, the guy who originally hired me, who was, he didn't own the company, he was one of the investors. Um, but he wasn't the chairman or whatever. But our chairman was a British guy named Kevin Burke, very smart guy, not a Russia specialist, but he had done work all over the world, and he understood how these guys operated. And there was a realization that ultimately, he who sits on it really controls it, and everything was always a negotiation, but that ultimately they were going to do whatever they ultimately wanted to do. We could fight, but you got to remember in the 1990s, as soon as you had the lawyer up, you lost, and that was one of the things I used to tell people all the time. If
Right.
you have to, if you think you have to go to the courts to resolve a commercial dispute, you've already lost.
Yeah.
Now, things
Yeah.
started changing eventually, and the thing is, in Russia, it got to a point where actually you could have a fair fight in the courts, even
Yeah.
against a very powerful Russian interest. Um, but at that point in time, it's the thing people have to remember is it was interesting for me because, like, at the time, I thought looking at countries like Poland, where they Poland took the complete opposite approach to privatization than Russia. Poland was very slow in privatization, but they created the institutions and the ecosystem to support and sustain a market economy and to resolve commercial disputes, et cetera. The thing also is Poland had the leg up because they had a commercial culture up until up until World War II.
Right.
And even
Right.
then, under socialism, it was very light socialism light. And then they did privatization. Russia, because of the situation and the circumstances and the political issues, they had to really aggressively privatize things quickly. And people forget there was a legitimate fear that Zyuganov and the communists would come back. So they had to get everything out in public hands as fast as they could, which created the oligarchs and created chaos. But they didn't create those institutions or culture for quite a while. It took a while to put that in place.
Right.
So, when you got involved, unless you're nuts or, really foolish, you kind of had to understand the rules of engagement, and that there were things you could fight, and then there were things where it wasn't worth it.
Yeah, so how did you, just out of curiosity, how did you learn that? I mean, you're a young person, right? Is it because of your family background and it was your intuition, or how did you learn how to
So,
operate and made you different than your boss?
you know, I think a lot of it goes back to learning and understanding the difference between the culture, like that first trip to the Soviet Union in '86, and
Yeah,
understanding, it's way beyond language. A friend of mine who, went into recovery and gave up drugs and alcohol a long, long time ago. I'll never forget, he was going through the whole 12-step thing. And I may be paraphrasing it incorrectly, but the expression recovery is the first step towards, I'm sorry, acceptance is the first step towards recovery.
Okay.
And I use that all the time, almost every day in my business, because, looking at what we do with companies that we work with our clients, before you can fix things, you have to really kind of accept the reality, whether it's the reality of what you're doing wrong, the reality of the limitations you have and the control you have and don't have, the environment, all these things. And, I think that there was a certain understanding that, and I don't mean to be passively accepting of stuff that exists around you. And, trust me, I mean, I got there, I was a young neocon, campus Republican, grandson of a Russian immigrant who believed in the American way, democracy, and the market system, and that everything communist and socialist was just patently evil. And I was there to change things, God damn it, if it killed me.
Yeah.
But I also understood that there were some things that, that transcend systemic or other limitations that are ultimately cultural. I mean, a lot of the things that a lot of people labeled as being Soviet tendencies were really more just cultural Russian tendencies that were just as messed up in the Tsarist era, going back hundreds of years. And and a lot of the things people associate with Marxism, Leninism, you could argue are more Russian.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so did you, because you had the language, right? Did you learn some of this because you had Russian friends and you were more integrated into a non-Western environment so you could see it and sort of absorb it?
I think it was a mixture of things. I had a series. I was single at the time. I had a bunch of Russian girlfriends. My
Yeah.
first serious Russian girlfriend, she was the daughter of a polkovnik. Her father was a big deal in the army, and she grew up mostly in East Germany. And she didn't speak any English. And first of all, it was a great relationship in terms of helping my Russian.
Yeah.
Um, but also, dealing with her, I mean, she was an incredible pain in the ass. She was very complicated. And, I used to joke that, dealing with a Russian girlfriend is sometimes like trying to diffuse an IED. I
Yeah.
mean, if anybody says American women are difficult, they clearly haven't dated Russian women. And it gave me a lot, I think, of field training into the Russian mindset, obstacles, cultural and otherwise. Um, I think, like I said, it goes back to acceptance as the first step towards recovery. And,
Right.
it was really a matter of like, this is messed up. It makes no sense, but it is what it is. It's real. And that doesn't mean I roll over and just throw my hands up and be passive, but I need to adapt, improvise, and overcome, as the Marine Corps says.
Yeah.
And that's something else. I've always lived by the Marine Corps creed: adapt, improvise, overcome. And it's one of the things, if one of my three kids was sitting here, you'd see them rolling their eyes because they've heard that like umpteen times every day. And it's something
Right.
I stress to them in life. If I teach you anything, you need to learn to adapt, improvise, overcome. And if you can do that in life, whether it's in a professional or personal or relationship setting or whatever, you're going to be okay. You may
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
win every battle, but you'll have a better chance of survival.
Right. Right.
So I think in a sense, it was that adaptability that helped me out a lot.
Yeah.
And I was lucky because, after the Orange Fanta guy, after that trip, that was it. They basically said, you're a good guy. We'll work together on other projects, but you're just not suited for this. This isn't, this
Who
isn't your
said
environment.
that? Who
Yeah.
said that? His bosses?
Well, he went back and told them, that they should fire me because I disobeyed his direct orders. And they basically said, you know what? We're firing you because what he did was bold and arguably insubordinate, but it was the best thing for the company. And you're a good guy, and we'll probably work with you on other things in the future, but you're not suited for this project.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Look, these guys who are behind this, none of them knew Russia, but they all had been involved in other parts of the world, ranging from China to Thailand to Papua New Guinea to South America. So again, acceptance is that first step. They
Right,
understood what they didn't understand.
right, right.
And I think that they came out of that with significant amount of confidence in me, in that they knew I wasn't going to like tell them how to prioritize which reservoir base, or what the production capacity could be, and definitely not on the coming up with the best financing schemes, because I was useless in all that. But I
Right.
understood how to get stuff done. I understood how to scan the horizon and determine what were risks and what were opportunities. And in our business now, we talk with our clients about, there's real risk and then there's CNN risk. And our
Uh-huh.
job is to help our clients not home in on the CNN risk. And no offense to CNN, we could easily call it Fox risk, MSNBC risk, Al
Right,
Jazeera risk, whatever. But you know
right.
what I mean.
Yes.
It's to focus on what are the real issues, and that's the challenge. And that's what we do every day at Macro-Advisory. We know our environment, and we help our clients identify challenges and risks ahead on the horizon, and be better prepared to deal with the real risks and not get distracted by the noise.
Yeah. So let's go back to this oil joint stock company, and how did it end up? What's the bottom line on this, and how did
I,
you then move on from it?
well, after just over 3 years, and these were probably the three most difficult years in Russia, not counting the Second World War.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Not to imply like what I went through was like the siege of Leningrad, not even close. But short of that, probably three of the most difficult years to be in that country. I was at a point where I was grinding my teeth. I was just, I got really burned out. And that was one of the challenges those days in Russia. It was very easy to get burned out.
Uh-huh.
And I became increasingly cynical. I found myself being like some of the people I'd meet at the embassy who would say really rude and obnoxious things about Russians. I um I realized I needed to get out of Dodge.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I had an incredibly exciting, challenging, rewarding period. And there were other things going on. I needed a break. I needed to get out. So where we were on the project, and I had earned equity and some other stuff. So we worked out a deal where I would transition out and I left. Um, and the irony is, when I left in July of 1994, I'll never forget being on that. First of all, the night before I left, my friends in Moscow organized a going away party at the Hotel Budapest. And I don't know if you remember, like in the early days in Russia, it was in the expat community, it was always a succession of, going away parties or welcome back parties.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I was one of the drunkest I've ever been, where I still remember my actions. And
Uh-huh.
there was a stage, and there was a band, and there was a microphone. Somebody's doing a toast, and I got up there and I was like, "F you guys, I'm leaving. I'm never coming back again. Have a nice life. Bye." Mic drop.
Uh-huh.
And everybody's laughing. And the next day, with that horrible hangover, I'll never forget being on that flight. It was the Delta flight to Frankfurt with all the Polish flight attendants. I'm so hungover. And as we're taking off and hearing that, the landing gear coming
Yeah.
up into the fuselage, I just let out this breath, And it was one of the happiest, most relaxed moments of my life. And I'll tell you why, because I knew I was never going back again. Of course,
Uh-huh.
fast forward, I was back not long after, and up until the war started, I was back and forth on a very regular basis. And,
Right.
I was talking
Oh, was
with,
that the last time you lived there, though?
it's the last time I lived there,
Yeah. Okay.
but, ever since then, I mean, before the war started, I was in Moscow at least every other month.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and when I
Right.
left there, my wife, we actually, it's a long story. We actually met at CIS in grad school, and we weren't dating, but she ended up in Russia with the IFC. And we were good friends for years. It was kind of a when Harry meets Sally kind of relationship. And
Yeah.
we started dating really in my last month or so in Moscow. And she was still in Russia for another 6 months after I left. So I left, and then I came back that next November, and I spent almost a month, in Moscow hanging out with her. And of course, I'm running into all my friends at various bars, and they're like, "You swore you were never coming back." And I'm
Right.
like, "I
Right.
know. Where's the
Yeah.
crow? I'll eat
It
it."
came to
Yeah.
haunt you. So those 3 years were pretty formative. They probably felt like they were 10 at least, right?
They
Um,
probably felt like 10, and they probably took 20 off my lifespan. But yeah, no, it was, I mean, I was there for two coups and an incredible period of transition. Um, Big ups, big downs. Um, One of the experiences and one of the quotes I always use, I mentioned like when I first got there, how White Knights was out there, and there was a guy, I
right.
can't remember his name, who was one of the senior operations guys out on site at White Knights. And I was trying to meet up with this guy. I just wanted to pick his brain. And, it became very obvious that he really had about as much interest in meeting me as he did in catching a bad cold. But,
Yeah.
I was very persistent, and he finally relented. He's like, "Well, if you're going to be up here, next week, I'm around, but, I'm busy, whatever." I'm not good at reading the room. So I went up, and this guy was from Oklahoma, very smart guy, very experienced guy. And I'm there talking to him. And, in hindsight, he's like thinking, why am I wasting time talking to this kid from DC? What the hell does he want from me? And, he's got a coffee can. And I'm like, so what's it like? Tell me, what's, what do I need to know about running and developing an energy project here in Russia? And he kind of squints, takes the can, ting, big stream of dip into this empty coffee can. He goes, "Son, it ain't dull, and we pray for boredom." And if I ever write a book, that's going to be the title. And
Right.
that really summed up the whole experience there. Um, the other quote that I love is we were working with Allen and Overy, the law firm, and one of the partners at Allen and Overy was originally Russian. And when we had what was really ultimately the final big negotiation where we signed the real deal that became this company. Um, we had all these people coming in from London, and I was there at the airport meeting them at Sheremetyevo. And later that night, we flew out on a charter to Siberia. But this Russian partner from Allen Overy turned to all my colleagues, including our chairman. He goes, "Gentlemen, prepare for the difficulties." It's another quote from that period I love. And
Wow. Wow.
and we kept saying that we were going to make up team T-shirts with the company logo on the front, and then on the back in quotes, "Prepare for the difficulties."
Prepare for the difficulties. So what happened to the company?
So the company, after I left, went through a lot of gymnastics and changes. Are you familiar with Sibir Energy, which was run by a guy named Henry Cameron?
I vaguely.
So
It's sort of back
ultimately,
there
they
somewhere. Yeah.
became the operators of that field we brought online, and then another one of the fields. But over time, it all got picked apart. Some of the original stakeholders still had a stake in what became Sibir Energy.
Uh-huh.
Um, the original joint stock company we created was called Sinco, Siberian Oil Company, not Sibneft, but it was Sinco.
Simco.
Um, and but it really got picked apart, and that field and another one were bundled into what became Sibir Energy.
Okay. Okay.
And some of the guys I worked with out of London and a couple of the people in Moscow stayed with them. And, I kind of lost touch. I mean, I basically cashed out, um, after I left. And while I stayed in touch with a number of the people I worked with, it was, I just kind of moved on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's interesting because I left, I had a lot of really attractive offers to go back. Um, the CPC team in Houston, again, this is like 95, I think. They were really aggressively pursuing me, and I was like, yeah, I'll come to Houston. If I go back to Moscow, I'm gonna die. I just can't do it. I just can't do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy to go back and forth, but it was interesting because I moved to London and I was working in consulting and advisory. And again, it was back and forth. We did a lot of work with Arco on the Lukoil relationship and
Uh-huh.
among other things. And had the opportunity to go to Arco, to Phillips, a bunch of other companies that were clients that were active in the region. And then out of left field, Stephen Jennings reached out to me because we were clients of Credit Suisse First Boston. And as an originally Australian company, a bunch of the Australians I worked with knew Stephen Jennings back from the Australia New Zealand days before he moved
Okay.
to London. And so we had a close working relationship. And he reached out to me and said, hey, we're setting up this new bank. It's before they even had the name Renaissance. Do you want to come and join us? And I knew a lot of the guys. And I was like, I don't want to move back to Moscow. And he's like, no, well, you can move to New York or London, help us launch the business. And I was, Stephen, I said to him, I said, Stephen, look, I mean, there's a million brokers out there. Like, I don't know anything about that business. He's like, look, I
Yeah.
could teach a rhesus monkey how to be a broker and pass the Series 7 exam in a weekend. He goes, I can't teach any of these guys what makes the Russian energy business tick. He goes, you've lived in Siberia, you've gotten drunk and done banyas with half of these guys. He's like, you know the story inside and out. I can't teach that. And it's kind of funny because for years I said I'd live anywhere in the world but New York. And I had these job offers with clients in the energy sector. And the day he made me this offer to move to New York was the day my wife and I found out she was pregnant with our first. She grew up in New Jersey. Her mom and sister were living there at the time. And it was one of those things like if I had gotten that offer months earlier or months later, probably would have stayed in the industry.
Yeah.
But the idea of being in New York, working market hours, being a parent and being around and having that support system for her. I mean, Phillips Petroleum was a really exciting opportunity, new business development,
Yeah.
but I would have been on the road 60+% of the time, and she would have been, barefoot and pregnant or with little kids in a dry town in a dry county, 45 minutes from the nearest wine store in Tulsa. Not that it's all
Yeah.
about wine, but for a girl from New
Right.
Jersey who lived in Asia and Russia and all over the world, that wasn't exactly an ideal. So I
Yeah.
ended up working at RenCap, and that's how I got into the investment banking world.
Okay. 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 And so then you made your career for a period of time
Yeah,
in
still dealing with Russia, Eurasia.
yeah.
I went to RenCap, helped launch the New York office. We had a lot of fun, worked on the VimpleCom IPO and a
Uh-huh.
lot of exciting things. And
Then
again, I
you were
learned,
that VimpleCom was the first um IPO for a Russian company
on the New York Stock
on
Exchange,
the
the
New York
first
Stock
first
Exchange.
New York IPO.
Right. And
Um,
a number of people reference that as like a seminal moment, you
it
know.
was pretty amazing, and I got to tell you that that deal, that IPO was so exciting. Um, the roadshow was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Going back and forth for 2.5 weeks hopscotching North America on a Gulf Stream, where we would literally like do 3 cities in a day. I didn't realize the value of a corporate jet until we did that deal. Where
Uh-huh.
we would literally like land in Chicago, have a breakfast, have 3 meetings, get on the plane, fly to Minneapolis for lunch, get on the plane, fly to Des Moines for a dinner, get on the plane, be in New Jersey the next morning. I mean, it was, but also, getting to know and deal with that management team was really exciting. Great people, a
Yeah.
great company, world-class company, that just happened to be in Russia with significant Russian ownership and significant Russian leadership.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it was really important because it showed the market that Russia is not what McCain called a giant gas station.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot more to it and a lot of incredible talent and skill there too.
Yeah. And was that deal kind of what made Renaissance Capital?
No, I think it was one of the many. I mean, what made Renaissance Capital? I think
Yeah.
what made Renaissance Capital was what made First Boston when those guys ran First Boston. And that's that they were local and they were able to source information, liquidity, assets in ways that nobody else could. And it was a very important learning experience for me because, looking at macro advisory, I mean, unlike any of our competitors, we cover the region from the region. I'm the
Uh-huh.
outlier, spending
Uh-huh.
most of my time, in DC. And I got 2 guys to support me in Washington doing, US sanctions and policy stuff. But Chris and all of our analysts and consultants, everybody on the collection analysis, execution, and advisory side, they're based in the region. They're based in Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, et cetera. And I think looking back at RenCap, um, being local, again, a hybrid. It was Western leadership and Western structure and Western standards, but being local and having access into the local market and local information and local analysis, um, really was the big a differentiating factor. I mean, you know, we would, I mean, looking back at years later when I was at places like ING Barings and at Credit Agricole, I stopped telling stories to colleagues of mine about the kind of spreads and the kind of profitability we had on trades. And I stopped because they didn't believe me. They thought I was just bullshitting them. No, I'm serious. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
we
Yeah.
would take a $1 million order in some illiquid aviation stock and we would make $500,000 on that trade, at least on the spread. I mean, we may have even made more in terms of other ends of it that I didn't even see.
Yeah.
Um, and the client was thrilled because they were getting it for substantially less than any other broker because we were doing it locally.
Yeah.
Um, so, what was the real profit engine in that firm? I mean, it was a lot of things. The trading was profitable. The deals were incredibly profitable. Things like VimpleCom having an IPO that high profile and managing it with DLJ and Merrill Lynch was a huge, huge victory. And then there were other deals too. Um, it was an interesting experience.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
was I was also very fortunate. I had some good timing. I had good timing that was intentional when I moved to Russia. I had very good timing that was fortuitous when I left RenCap. ING Barings reached out to me. The person who was running their EMEA desk in New York left, and they were in a tough spot because they'd already had turnover, and they needed someone right away. And they made me the proverbial offer I couldn't refuse, which came with not just Russia, but all of Central Europe, Egypt, Israel, Greece, and Portugal were still emerging markets then. And yeah, so I left RenCap because I had this amazing offer and more markets. And Stephen, who I was good friends with, was very angry with me for a long time. But it was also I left in July of 1998, and I dodged a bullet when the crisis hit.
Right.
and RenCap and everybody else that was in the market got really slammed. I mean,
Yeah.
RenCap, they're smart guys. They ended up, they clawed their way back and they were profitable again. And they got whacked a few years later. They clawed their way back. Um, they were some of the smartest people I've ever met, and I enjoyed my time with them. But that was a case of just really fortuitous. I'd love to say, like when I wrote those things for my boss, the Australian guy, that it was based on analysis, but it was really just circumstances and just
Yeah.
dumb luck.
Yeah. Right. And so did you were competing with Troika at that time, Troika
Yeah.
Dialog.
And then
Yeah.
actually I went to Troika. So I went to ING Barings for a couple of years, and then
Yeah.
Troika was made the decision to get into the US market. So I became like the go-to guy to launch businesses in the US.
I
I
see.
launched, so after RenCap, and I was part of the team that launched that, I went to Troika, launched their US office. I launched the US office for what was then Necoil, became Uralsib. And then I launched the New York business, the US business, and the UK business. Um, for Necoil, Uralsib, and then for Otkritie.
Uh,
Um, but yeah, Troika, Bernie hired me in early 2000. Um, and at the event, it was nice to catch up with him. And I'm
yeah.
very open with Bernie. I'm still mad at him because he hired me, and then the day I arrive in Moscow, my first day, he tells me, "Oh, by the way, I haven't announced it yet, but you should know I'm quitting my role. I'm going to stay with Troika, but I'm no longer going to be running the business. But I've hired this really great guy to replace me named Jacques, this French guy." And I'm like, Bernie, maybe we should have this discussion before I came,
Right.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
I still like Bernie, but that's where Chris Weaver and I got to know each other. We worked together at Troika,
At Troika.
and then um, in 2001 was when Uralsib Necoil decided to make the big push. And they actually reached out to three of us, myself, a woman named Sylvia Armand Delille, who ran the European business. And she and I worked really closely together at Troika. She's a great person. She was honestly one of the best brokers I've ever worked with. Super smart French lady, awesome person. And Chris, and they were recruiting the three of us as a team. Chris was really sort of sick of running the research department. He just wanted to be the strategist.
Uh-huh.
And Urals Necoil basically said, well, you can do that, but we need somebody to head up research. So come on board, you can do that. You can build up the research team and hire your replacement and then become chief strategist exclusively. And he didn't want to do that. So he, at the last minute, decided to stay at Troika. He later came and joined us as chief strategist.
Okay. Okay. And so so I want to make sure I understand that that was that was I want to say I read Uralsib, but you
Right.
mean it was um what I'm blanking now. The nickel
Necoil. So
yeah.
when we were recruited, when I first joined, it was still Necoil. And then
Yeah.
they had acquired Uralsib, which was a regional bank based out of Ufa, and they rebranded the whole bank as Uralsib.
Oh, okay. So what is Nicoil then?
So Necoil, interestingly enough, is a company it was a bank that was started by Nikolai Tsvetkov, who is one of the founders of Lukoil.
Okay.
Svetkov, I believe he was in Su-27 pilot. He was in the Soviet military. Incredibly smart guy, multi-billionaire. And he and Leonid Fedun and Alec Perov were the founders of Lukoil. And Svetkov was really more the finance guy. He's the guy who took Longapas, Urai, Kogalim, and kind of restructured this unified and consolidated group.
Uh-huh.
Um, Fedun was really more the sort of technical production guy, and Alec Perov was, kind of the big boss. Um, and what started out as sort of the pocket bank to Lukoil became at one point the largest private non-government owned bank in Russia. And when I was there, they fancied themselves as the Citibank of Russia, and they were,
Uh-huh.
retail, commercial, investment banking, brokerage, asset management. It was a fully integrated bank that outside of Sberbank, where, Sberbank, there's a Sberbank at every post office in Russia.
Right.
Um, Outside of Sberbank had the biggest retail branch network in Russia, bigger than
Okay.
Alpha. Um, so it was I was there 7 years. It was a 7.5 years. It was a great company, great job. We had terrific people. It was really one of the better managed financial services groups I've worked for. And they were big believers in the research product and the value of a brokerage business as a critical part of supporting all the other parts of their business. But again, it was like all the other situations, it wasn't RenCap, which was a Western bank that happened to be domiciled in Russia.
Uh-huh.
This was or Troika, which again, yes, Ruben Vardanian is not an American, but let me tell you something, Troika was an extremely Western organization, even though the majority of the people were Russian and was based in Russia.
Yeah.
Uh, Lukoil and Uralsib were very Russian organizations, but very from what it had its troubles in later years, but when I was there, it was a very well run company, and a very entrepreneurial one.
Right. And so did they somehow absorbed a lot of Western business practices and you know that they hired foreigners or they sent people abroad to study or probably some combination of
It
all
was a
those
mixture.
things.
I mean, a lot of the Russians there, for example, when I was there, they hired a new head of trading who was a Russian, uh, but he'd worked for UBS for, I don't know, 7, 8 years,
Yeah.
in Moscow, but also in Europe, and spent time in America, so he understood how the business was done. Um, the My boss for much of my tenure there was a Russian who later ran Alpha, the Alpha Capital, ran the asset portfolio for Russian railways, was one of the most commercial people I've ever met. Yeah, he's Russian, but a lot of family in the US, spent a lot of time in America over the years. And, I mentioned before, like about how acceptance is the first step. He's a perfect example, a guy who really was very pragmatic and didn't have preconceived notions of what the best way to do things are. He was a total
Hmm.
macro manager. One interesting thing was, so I was originally hired by they brought in a guy an Irishman who came from Goldman Sachs and worked at UBS, was a very seasoned investment banker, worked in corporate finance, focusing on energy for years to build up this business and westernize it. And he didn't really last that long. He was a great guy. It was really more, he had, a big family, a lot of kids, and uh, his family just wasn't happy making the transition over to Russia, so he left. And they brought in this other guy who had been working in another group in the bank, and I was very skeptical at first because he didn't have Western credentials, and I thought, oh God, now we're really screwed. And fast forward about a year and a half later, and I was complaining to my wife because I never, this guy who was my boss was not, we didn't really communicate a lot.
Uh-huh.
And she's like, okay, let me get this straight. Are you happy with the way he's paying you? Yes. What about your bonuses? I actually am very happy. He gave me more than I expected. And everything you need and want, you've gotten? Yes. And you're complaining that he isn't calling you every day? Or she's like, do you realize I've had to sit and listen to you for the last number of years, bitching and moaning about all these people you work for who micromanage you every day. And now you have a guy who leaves you alone and you're complaining that he isn't,
Right, right,
and
right.
I'm like, point taken. And
Yeah.
I think that was a big part of the success of our business was this guy's name is Igor Kolomaisky. I'm still in touch with him. He lives in Dubai now. Wonderful person. Honestly, one of the smartest people I've ever worked for. And I've worked
Yeah.
for some really smart people, but was just an incredibly smart and effective manager.
Hmm. 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 Hmm.
And you know what? He knew what he didn't know. Again, the acceptance part. He
Yeah.
understood that he hadn't worked in aspects of this business for years, but once people under him earned his trust and respect, he let them, he just, he trusted them and
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
gave them what resources they asked for if he felt it was reasonable and made sense.
Yeah.
So, and very just naturally commercial.
Right. So, one of the sort of theories about when I was writing the book and talking to people was that but that Russians absorbed this commercial culture in the period of the 90s, but that by 1998 they began realizing they didn't always need foreigners anymore. That there was enough expertise developed to to use Russians for managers at that point. Would you agree with that?
I'm sorry. Sorry, I've
All
got
right.
this client chasing me. I'm just
All right.
reiterating. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, okay. So that sort of my part of my conclusion or whatever thesis summary from many of the interviews and what I looked at for the book was that Russians were very anxious to learn Western skills, that the opening to the West was to learn the commercial skills and the technical skills without ever intending to sort of give the country up to the Westerners, which is not how Westerners actually saw it. But that by 1998 and the crisis in 1998, Russians had absorbed or had gotten almost to the point where they needed foreigners less. Um,
Yeah.
that was a critical sort of turning period of, they graduated enough with enough skill level that they didn't need then to pay exorbitant salaries to foreigners and all the benefits and everything else that went with it to get that expertise. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, it was an interesting shift because for a long time it was a real challenge um, to recruit good people. Then it became much easier, and there was all this talent. And then it had the opposite challenge. So, like for example, when I was in the U.S., um, it became very difficult to hire all these Russians who had, gone to Harvard Business School or Columbia Business School or NYU and were in the US because they were going back to Moscow where they were being paid more. They were paying 15% or 13% flat income tax. you know,
Yeah.
it became very difficult. And, there became this period of cycling out the expats. I mean, as I told you before, again, guys like me, Marcus, I mean, you look at the list of the people, like that were at that conference the other day, most of us were profoundly unqualified for the jobs we had, other than the fact that we had some common sense and we spoke the language and we were willing to subject ourselves to living there.
Yeah.
Um, and that really changed, and I look at RenCap as an example. Like when I was first at RenCap, the number of people there that were in front end jobs that were client facing, vast majority of them were expats. Well, fast forward a decade and it was the inverse, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and and that's one thing that look, I look back at Russia over 36 years, and I obviously believed in the Russia story. I gambled my life on it in the sense that I moved there. I turned down these great offers at Mobil and JP Morgan because I believed in it. Did it develop exactly how I expected? No. In some ways, better and faster, and other ways, not. I mean, it ended up evolving much differently than what I expected. But I
Right.
also think at the end of the day, the transition to experienced, skilled managers, et cetera, was far faster than anybody expected.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the learning curve, look, one of the things I learned, I did business for a while in Brazil when I was actually at Uralsib. We developed a pretty good niche of business in Brazil with Brazilian hedge funds, prop desks, and some of the fund managers there and the banks. And what I realized very quickly was that these people intuitively understood real emerging market risk better than most because it was in their DNA, literally. Like when you grow up in an environment where there hasn't been a default, but there have been many defaults, where there's been coups, where there's been, disappearances of people at night, where corruption on the street is, whatever. You understand some of these things intuitively far better than someone like myself who grew up in Connecticut and went to a prep school is ever going to be able to learn. Um,
Right. Right.
and I saw how well some of these Brazilians were able to thrive and excel in that market. And one thing RenCap was very good at, and this comes down to like people like Boris Jordan and Stephen Jennings, were really good at spotting talent and people in that were coming from parallel markets. And they hired a lot of people who, in the beginning weren't Russian or Russia specialists, but could make that transition. And the way, Steven said to me, look, I can teach a rhesus monkey how to get a Series 7 and be a broker. I can't teach you. I can't teach them, these brokers, how what makes Russia tick.
Right.
So, but at the end of the day, in Russia, the level of sophistication and capabilities and talent. And I also think, for all of the conventional wisdom view of Russia, I think the level of corporate governance, compliance, the way things are done, transacted in the corporate world as well as even on the streets, advanced and developed so many ways. I mean, VimpleCom was a classic example of developing market leapfrogging. People who didn't have telephones in their houses jumped right to cellular. And one of the selling points for VimpleCom as well as MTS was the saturation rate. In Russia, at that phase in the late 90s, it was over 100% cell phone ownership. People had multiple cell phones.
Right. Right.
Um, it's the same thing when it comes to how things, banking. People don't go to a bank branch and have a passbook. Everybody does things online. So they've leapfrogged in so many ways, the West. And I think, Russia gets a bum rap because for all of its troubles, shortcomings, inefficiencies, corruption, whatever, it's significantly more functional than it gets credit for. And frankly, significantly more functional than other countries in the broader region that the conventional wisdom looks upon as being more westernized, democratic, and palatable.
Mm.
Again,
Yeah.
I'm not commenting on Russia's policy, on how they've prosecuted the war and conflict in Ukraine, et cetera. But I think the bottom line in terms of how things work there is, if you read, if you watch CNN or you read the New York Times or you read what Bill Browder writes, you're going to have a very different view than I think what actually exists.
Yeah. 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 Well, I guess that's close to me, my kind of wrap up. But I think, I mean, my hypothesis here is that this transition to a market economy was accomplished, and that Russia is a market economy. It's a Russian market economy, but that it's that recognition of that transition is not is not well understood or not accepted, if you will, to use your earlier term.
I think it's arguably one of the most market economies of all market economies.
Hmm,
It's um, Russian friends have joked for years, and it's sad but true. There's more communists and socialists in New York, in Cambridge, Mass, and Berkeley, California, than there are in all of Russia.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so it's different than our economy. Um, yeah, I mean, even you look at companies like Lukoil, where there's no government ownership, but Lukoil has always been managed and sees itself as a guiding bearer of the Putin Russian state economy.
yeah.
And they don't need the Kremlin as a shareholder to call and say, do this, do that. They understand exactly what they need to do because it goes back to, like, you know, when I was in Siberia and we had this portfolio of all these assets, and my colleagues, they're high-fiving each other. And I'm like, guys,
Mhm.
it doesn't work that way. These
Yeah,
aren't
yeah,
ours. These have been
yeah.
parked
These are
here.
numbers.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
just we got plenty to celebrate, but not what you're celebrating.
right,
Okay.
right.
And the way these companies and the way things work in the Russian environment is it's very different. But look, when I lived in Moscow in the early 90s, being with an accredited foreign company, I had my yellow license plate. It was the British company, the mothership, the operational ship that was the accredited company. So I had a license plate that started in 001. So the Gaishniki, the traffic cops, would see me coming. And I could see the big fat smile as they pointed what we called the Pajolsta stick, the little black and
Right,
white
right.
baton, and they'd pull me over and they'd come over. And, originally they start out with, like, you're in violation of article this, they give you the little salute. Hey, you're in violation of this, your license plate's dirty, your directional little signals aren't bright enough, whatever. After a while, they didn't even go with the pretense. They just go, hey, dude, come on, I'm making $25 a month. What are you getting paid? Come on, Davai, Padavik, help me out, man.
Right.
And it was a negotiation. They'd ask for $100 and you'd walk away, maybe giving them $5. Sometimes I just, use my best Ruski mat and say horrible things about their mother, and they would laugh and send me on my way.
Yeah.
But
Uh-huh.
there was a
Uh-huh.
period where I literally couldn't drive from one side of the town to the other. My wife, who was not even my girlfriend at the time, she was with the IFC, and the IFC and World Bank, they gave them full diplomatic status. So she used to joke that I used to like to have her drive with me because she would pull out her red diplomatic kartochka. After they'd pull me over, she'd pull it out, and then they would just, like, salute and send us on our merry way. And that ended the negotiation very quickly.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
fast forward, I remember, years later visiting Moscow. I'm with a bunch of my buddies, and we're on our way to Sanduny. And I don't remember why we got pulled over. Nobody had been drinking yet. Everything, we were all fine. But I was just impatient. And I'm like, come on, man, let's go, let's go, let's go. And my friend who was in the front seat, the other, his buddy was driving. And these guys all speak far better Russian than I do. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
they all came from sort of the white Russian diaspora and learned Russian in their churches. And anyway, completely bicultural, bilingual, but they were still living there and understood the rules of engagement of the time better than I did. And at one point I got frustrated and I'm like, I like lean forward and I pull out like a handful of rubles and I'm like looking to the cop. I'm like, dude, what do you want? How much? And my friends were horrified. And they're like, oh,
Right.
excuse him, he's been drinking. And then they're like, what are you doing? And I'm like,
Yeah.
let's just get out of here. And they're like, they don't do that anymore. They were
Right.
they wear cameras. They have bosses and sergeants and lieutenants and captains that oversee them. Like, trying to bribe a cop in Moscow is no different than if you try to bribe a cop in New York or Philadelphia. Well, maybe Philadelphia is different, but
Right.
they're
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
you just don't do that. Where have you been? And it was a real eye-opening experience because I realized that I was still very in touch with a lot of things culturally and business-wise, but there are other aspects where things had actually progressed far greater, far faster than I realized.
Right. Right, right, right. Well, so I'm kind of at the point I think where we I want to kind of wrap this up, but I'm wondering, are there things that I didn't ask you about that you feel are important that you would like to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, how do you encapsulate the last 36 years in a conversation like this? It's not
Yeah,
easy to do. I mean, I think, from my end, I think I've made it pretty clear what I think were critical factors for me and what I did and where I saw and qualities I saw help other individuals and companies succeed while others failed. And I think that comes down to, understanding limitations and being bicultural as well as bilingual and understanding the historical context. I think that underscores the need for us as a country and society to get back to more education and bring back these Russia programs. I have three kids. My middle one, my younger son, is an officer in the Navy, and he did what the Navy ROTC calls the LREC program, where you put language, regional, cultural. It's like the Army FAO program. So his focus was Russia and Eurasia. And he asked me for a list of the top Russia studies programs, and I gave him a list of about a dozen. Came back to me a day or two later, looked at me like I was a complete moron. He's like, "Dad, your intel's out of date." Only five of those schools still had a Russian program,
yeah,
and it's a real problem. It's a real
yeah,
problem. I mean, I look at my clients, just the major oil companies we work with alone, they've completely eviscerated the US intelligence community's institutional memory and subject matter expertise on Russia. And while I'm happy for old friends that they're making more than they did in the USG and they can send their kids to the college of their choice. On the other hand, as an American who loves my country, I worry because, well, we have a lot of really good public servants. How do you replace that institutional memory? And,
yeah,
kids like my son, it's great he has an interest in it. It'll be another 20 years before he understands enough to be of any use.
yeah, yeah,
So, I think if there's anything that as a country and a society we need to do, we need to, whether it's the government funding it. And look, the fact that the Navy has this program and they've identified Russian as important as Urdu, Farsi, Arabic, Chinese is really positive. But we need more than that because at the end of the day, the high schools and colleges are only going to, you know, it's based on demand.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
no different than P&L. And until
yeah.
there's that demand, they're not going to bring those programs back.
Right, right, right. No, I agree with you. I agree with you. And, I think part of the reason for this archive is to preserve historical memory, whether hopefully there will be people who will be trying to gain that understanding that'll find this useful and give them some insight into how it was in that period of time when Americans and Russians spent a lot of time together, whereas
Yeah.
now none, not at all on either side. So, yeah. So thank you,
No, thank you
appreciate
for
it.
doing this. I think it's fantastic you're doing this because there's so much that, would be lost to history without it. And if
Yeah,
there's anything I can do to help at any point in time, any follow-ups you have, you know how to find me.
yeah. Good, good. Thank you. I appreciate it.